Hi everyone. I thought it would be a nice idea if I did a narration of my presentation that I gave at the salon yesterday. The topic that I decided to do was what Midnight in Paris taught us about nostalgia and parenting. And for those of you that are familiar with Reddit, I did a too long didn't read. Our kids are going to be just fine. For those of you that have never seen Midnight in Paris, I love the film. It follows the character Gil Pender, and he's a man who spends his life longing for the past, which to him is a simpler, more meaningful time. But what he doesn't realize until a journey back in time is that things aren't as idyllic as he had once thought. It's when his travels conclude in the 1890s that he realizes that despite the allure of nostalgia, any period can eventually become mundane, and it's really best to embrace life in the present. After watching Midnight in Paris, I realized that I was Gil. I love to live vicariously through the characters of different decades, imagining what life could have been. If only, I would love to be in the 60s and experience that. But growing up, I had longed to have a family like the ones in those 1950s Betty Crocker commercials. The mother in the fitted, beautiful dress with the clean pressed apron, and the father doting over his wife. The 2.5 kids, of course, named Jane and Johnny, were happily eating the home cooked meal that mother made. Now, the children were always free to ride their bike up and down the street, stay outside all day with their friends with no fear of danger. What a time to be alive and to have a family. But now we're here. It's 2018, and I have to inspect the neighborhood before I can let my 5-year-old son play outside. Cars are always racing up and down the street. For him to play with the neighbor boy across the street, it has to be carefully orchestrated so nobody gets hurt. I didn't even get the background check on his parents yet, so I'm still a bit hesitant to let him play over there anyway. And of course, inside the house isn't much better. The television shows are turning his brain to mush, and it takes all the strength I have to convince all parties involved that the benefits of a family meal together at the end of the day. This doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what's going to happen when he begins kindergarten in September. I find myself researching bulletproof backpacks. How heavy are they? I mean, he's pretty tall for his age, but will he just fall over with one on him? Does he need a cell phone at the age of 5 in case there's a bomb threat and he needs to call me and tell me that he loves me? What if he's kidnapped on the way to school? Or even more likely, what about the bullies? Where their emotional torment cause lasting damage to him as he gets older? These are the questions that I currently grapple with. So in the film, Gil travels from 2010 to 1920. He's fascinated. He's surrounded by authors and visionaries and artists, and to him, it really was the golden age. And I was curious just how life was like back in this time. Was it really that much better? Was it a better time to raise a family? And as we know, the 1920s was a time of jazz, sexual freedom is a boon to women's right to vote, and a flourishing economy. But it was also a time of gangsters, racism, and crime. The 18th Amendment became meant big business for the underground alcohol business, and the Ku Klux Klan became prominent, and really racial tensions ensued. But it wasn't just against Black people, there was a cultural civil war happening against all different groups, including the newly arriving immigrants. So I thought it would be a good idea to compare different trends from the 20s until now to see really what's the data telling us. So first, I wanted to look at child mortality rates. In the 95 years between 1920 and 2015, the global child mortality rate fell from 32.1% to 4.25%, which is great. The cause for high infant mortality rates during the 20s was not so much a lack of scientific evidence and knowledge, but a lack of education and available health services to women. So once we started getting more education and more assistance, the mortality rate started to decrease. When we look at health, disease, and vaccines, are we healthier now? What about all the disease that we hear from month to month? Well, as we know, at the beginning of the 20th century, infectious diseases were widely prevalent in the US and took an enormous toll on the population. So, for example, in 1920, almost 470,000 measles cases were reported, and of that, roughly 7,500 patients died. But during the 20th century, there was substantial achievements that were made to control many of the vaccine preventable diseases, and it has either completely eradicated or reduced to record low number of cases that we see today. Crime in the United States has also decreased. So as we can see, it's gone kind of up and down over the years, but right now we're in a pretty steep drop, which is great. Starting at the 1920s, we're roughly around 800,000 murders of Americans for that year, but now we're about 400,000 to 500,000 Americans. Globally, even across Europe, we see a decrease in homicide rates from the 20s until now. Now, looking at education, which is so important, again, we're looking between 1920 and this stops at 2015. The amount of children older than 15 years of age that have had at least a basic education has increased from 38.6% to 86%. So by 1920, all states were required students aged 8 to 14 to attend school for part of the year. So again, huge increase. Economy. Between 1929 and 2015, there was a significant drop of the number of people living in extreme poverty. Globally, in 1929, there were 75.9% of people living in extreme poverty, and in 2015, just 9.6%. And this is a difference of 66% of people living in poverty from 1929 to 2015, which is incredible. Now, we have all these things, but what about our happiness and our satisfaction? So the Human Development Index, also known as HDI, it's a statistic that measures key dimensions of human development: a long, healthy life, being knowledgeable, and having a decent standard of living. From 1925 to 2015, the index score increased by 53%. Again, phenomenal. So I see a lot of progress and I see a lot of hope for parenting. As we saw just in the previous charts, it's never been a better time to grow up and to have a family. When you put knowledge and action together, it can create extraordinary progress. And as Pinker discussed, in order to harness the power of our knowledge, we need to be able to apply it in all directions, which I completely agree about. How do we apply science, technology, critical thinking, the arts, our creativity to foster areas in our education that help lead us to moments of brilliance? Thinking about global vision and understanding equals global actions. When we link critical thinking skills and technology, we can bridge gaps in education. We can use creativity for solutionary ideas, and we have a chance to foster our innate compassion. Now that our basic needs are being met, we can truly foster the compassion that's part of our psychological makeup. And like we saw in Enlightenment Now, 3/4 of the nonviolent resistant movements have succeeded, compared to only 1/3 of the violent ones. So that really tells us a lot of how we can engage with other people and spark change in a positive, progressive way. So, upon reflection, when I did this research, looking back, I came up with a few different ideas. I decided, I can give up that perfectly pressed apron and the 1950s household because I know what it means. It means that my son will have all of these wonderful privileges and the chance to make an extraordinary impact on this world. Of course, with privilege comes great responsibility, and that's one thing I'm going to really nurture in my son. I'll leave you with this one quote that I found in Enlightenment Now. So Steven Pinker said, "Those who are nostalgic for traditional folkways have forgotten how hard our forebears fought to escape them." And I think that's really true. We always think it was better in the past, but we really don't know. We can glamorize the past, we can have notions about it, but we're living right now and right here, and we can make it great. And we can be confident that we're doing just fine and our kids are doing just fine, and we can have an optimistic outlook on life. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.